Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Exonerated Nations, What's Menthol Got to Do with It? We are hosting this discussion on the predatory marketing practices of the tobacco industry, along with the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, and Finishing the Fight, which is a statewide tobacco grant. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Phillip Gardiner. He is the co-chair of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. He is a public health activist, administrator, evaluator, and researcher who throughout his research career has maintained his community activism to address racial disparities in health through writing, evaluating, and public speaking. So without further ado, Dr. Phillip Gardiner.
Well, thanks, Camille, and thank you all for having me. I'm going to dive into this thorny subject. Many of you know about it, and while there's not many of us here, hopefully this can be used in your work in the future. And unfortunately, it reflects what's gone on in our community for way too long. So let me share my screen. Make sure folks can see what I'm presenting here. Folks can see my screen?
I can see it.
Okay. So what's important, and I think where we start, is that this isn't just a fictional discussion of some type. We actually have recent data that was published last year that if you remove menthol from the marketplace, you're going to essentially save Black lives. And that's what my organization, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, is about. Punchline being that between 1980 and 2018, menthol cigarettes were responsible for 1.5 million new Black smokers, 157,000 smoking-related premature deaths among African Americans, and 1.5 million lives years lost among African Americans. Clearly, this is no minor issue, given that Black folks only constitute 12% of the population, but they account for 15% of all new smokers, 41% of smoking-related premature deaths, and 50% of the total menthol harm caused over the last 30 years. This is not a minor thing. Frankly, this is the main death killer of African Americans. I like to look at it this way. This is what I would suggest as a framework for our time. And though I know there are many other issues, there's a litany of other issues facing our community that leads us to the situation we find ourselves in today. I want to suggest to you that menthol cigarettes and flavored little cigars have been and are the main vectors of death and disease into Black, brown, and other poor communities of color. The COVID-19 pandemic has just thrown a spotlight on the health disparities and unequal treatment that poor colored communities have faced for hundreds of years in the United States. At this time, nothing could be more helpful than saving Black lives and showing that Black lives matter than getting menthol cigarettes and flavored little cigars straight out of the Black community. What I'm going to do with you today is I'm going to talk about what has become known as the African Americanization of menthol cigarettes. This is 60 years of predatory marketing by the tobacco industry, and it continues as we sit here and talk today. The tobacco industry's assault on the African American community, just stepping back from this, remembering that menthol cigarettes are created in the 1920s by Spud Webb. He put some menthol in his cigarettes and he began to market them as Spud cigarettes. By 1932, the Brown and Williamsons had come up with cool cigarettes. And it wasn't until the mid-1950s that we began to see filtered cigarettes, and Salem being the first one in 1956. But by the late 50s and early 60s, Brown and Williamson conducted a series of focus groups, both in the United States and in Canada, and actually sat down and saw that messages on television about menthol cigarettes resonated more greatly with African American smokers than their white counterparts. To which they put over 90% of their advertising budget into television ads. They began to use male actors with more Black features. They tripled the cigarette advertising in ebony. They began to use our idiom, a la James Brown, Papa's got a brand new bag, Menthol's got a brand new bag. And of course, we all heard of the Cool Jazz Festival. They began to use our lexicon, cool is this and cool is that. And probably most problematic among this whole thing is a great article by my colleague, Dr. Valerie Yerger, Smoking with the Enemy, the philanthropy of the tobacco industry to the Black community, literally all social, political, religious, cultural organizations, not all, but the majority, took and take money from the tobacco industry. It was a full court press. If you take anything away from this presentation this morning, I want you to take this slide away. This is the African Americanization of menthol cigarettes. In the early 1950s, only 5% of African Americans smoked menthol cigarettes. By 1968, that had almost tripled to 14%. By 1976, it had tripled again to 44%. By the mid-2000s, it was over 82%. We know today that 85% of African American adult smokers use menthol products. Question you have to ask yourself, where did this come from? How did this happen? This wasn't by accident or the like. Here's an ad for Salem cigarettes. I mentioned it started in 1956. This is an ad from 1958. It's your basic white couple in a meadow. Salem refreshes your taste. This is how menthol cigarettes were being sold in the 1950s. However, by the 1960s, here we have Elston Howard, catcher for the New York Yankees, supporting Cools and promoting them. Let's keep in mind, 1963 is the March on Washington for Civil Rights. 1963 is the bombing of the Birmingham church in Birmingham, Alabama. The Jim Crow is in full force. The fight against it is going on. The tobacco industry is way ahead of the curve. They're not only promoting Black folks on television, they're also hiring them into executive offices in North Carolina and Virginia. The tobacco industry was way out ahead on this. This is why, frankly, we're so far behind and dying from these products. By the late 1960s, early 1970s, a whole new bag, again, the James Brown reference, menthol smoking. There's a brother in a dashiki, beads, afro. Do you think they're aiming it at a certain group of people? Yes, they're aiming it at us, and very effectively, I should add. By the mid-1970s, here we have Newport alive with pleasure, brother in a suit and tie, playing basketball. They know Blacks like basketball and they're pushing Newports all the same. After all, if smoking isn't a pleasure, why bother? Similarly, in the mid-1970s, Winston gets in the game with Real, Rich, and Cool, what we call today bling bling. This is some 50 years ago. They're already pushing this in our community. By the 1980s, the menthol wars erupted in the United States. Everybody began to realize that Black folks were available in terms of this. Let me just back this up for you a minute. Keep this in mind. From 68 to 76, and said, look at that line. That's what then takes place here in the 80s, the fight for African Americans. All the major players knew, Cool, Newport, Salem, They knew the high traffic areas, they knew the parks, knew the street corners. Look, I lived in New York City at the time, in the late 70s, early 80s. I lived in Brooklyn and worked in Harlem, and I'd come about the subway, and there would be sampling vans blaring our music and giving away free menthol cigarettes. This is how I would get my menthol cigarettes in the late 70s and 1980s. This is the way thousands, tens of thousands of African Americans got theirs too. Again, here it's the early 1990s, and again it's using our idiom again, fire it up. Newport pleasure. Notice it's Newport pleasure. If we back up, it's alive with pleasure in 1976. By the early 90s, it's just Newport pleasure. Putting alive in a cigarette ad was drawing attention to the fact that you know that these products kill you. But again, it's our idiom, it's fun, it's exciting, etc. This is the early 2000s. Again, here it is, enticing. If you can see the outline of the lady in the back, this is what the tobacco industry is selling. It not only kills you, but it entices you. By 2004, we have the Cool Mix campaign. Think back that I just showed you that in the 60s, we were talking about cool jazz. By the 80s, it was fired up. By the 90s, it was fired up. In 2000, we're into hip hop. We're into DJ battles. We're into mixing. Okay, they're very clear in using our culture to push these things down our throat. The Cool Mix campaign of 2004 was an attempt to capitalize on hip hop in the Black community. Nationwide context of mixing, scratching, and DJing that was to culminate in the national contest in Chicago. Local opposition by African American groups grow and actually block the implementation or the existence of the Cool Mix campaign. Ultimately, the lawsuit brought by the attorney generals of New York, Massachusetts, and Illinois blocked this meeting in Chicago. Still, if you look at each of the images on the screen in front of you, each of the images was what was a pack of cigarettes looked like in 2003 and 2004 as a promo for this event. By 2011, they've gotten rid. First, it was Alive with Pleasure. Then it was Newport Pleasure. Now it's just Pleasure. They just have a little picture down here at the bottom of Newport. Everybody knows what this is now. Okay, this is what predatory marketing is like in our community. So, what is menthol? What is does? What are we talking about here? So I would suggest to you that menthol is the ultimate candy flavoring. At bottom, it helps the poison to go down easier. It masks the harsh taste of smoking. It's an anesthetic by definition. It has a cooling sensation, a numbing sensation. It leads to deeper inhalation. The deeper you inhale, the more nicotine you take in. The more nicotine and toxins you take in, the more addicted you become. The more addicted you become, the harder it is to quit. Let's be clear, that's why they put this stuff in there. Also, if there's menthol in the tobacco smoke, menthol inhibits nicotine metabolism. Just a little digression in terms of the science of this. When nicotine enters your body, goes to your brain, excites things, and goes back and gets metabolized in the liver, it's called cotinine. If there's menthol in the cigarette, the metabolism of nicotine and the cotinine is slowed down, meaning it stays in your body longer. We have data as it relates to that. Another set of big words, independent sensory activation of neurotransmitters. The punchline is, if there's menthol in the cigarette smoke, it activates more nicotine receptors in your brain, meaning the more nicotine receptors in your brain, the more they actively want to be filled. The more you want to have cigarettes, essentially the more addicted you become. where I used to work at the University of California Office of the President Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program. I was the program officer that oversaw the funding of the group that actually proved this point, that there are more nicotine receptors in the brain of people that use menthol cigarettes compared to those people who don't. Menthol increases salivary flow and transbuccal drug absorption. Another set of big words that simply said, if you chew tobacco that has menthol in it, the nicotine is able to pass the gum barrier much more effectively and get into your system because of the menthol. And then probably most problematic is menthol allows for greater cell permeability. When we say it leads to greater cell permeability, meaning if you're smoking a cigarette that has menthol in it, menthol penetrates the cell wall much more efficiently than if there isn't menthol in the smoke. The greater the efficiency in penetrating the cell, the more damage that is done. Why do you think African Americans die disproportionately of heart attack, stroke, and lung disease? What's interesting, and we'll have to keep this in mind going forward. I know the FDA has proposed to remove menthol as a characterizing flavor. And while this would be a major step forward, we're going to argue, meaning my group, the AATCLC, is arguing you need to get rid of menthol as an ingredient altogether, because just a little of it will do all the things that I just mentioned. And of course, a lot of it, which is in menthol cigarettes, even does more. The slide you see before you is an actual slide from the tobacco industry that they presented at a conference in 1993. In 1993, well, for every year for a number of years, the tobacco industry held scientific conferences. The conference in 1993 was on menthol. The punchline is that all tobacco products that are sold have some level of menthol in them. Whether it's your regular cigarettes like your Winstons and your Marlboros and your stuff like that, chewing tobacco, pipe tobacco, all of them have some menthol in it, not to mention menthol cigarettes themselves, which have much more. And while it would be helpful for the FDA to reduce to get rid of menthol as a characterizing flavor, they need to get rid of it altogether because it's still going to have the properties that I mentioned prior. Many of us need to know this, particularly for Black folks, melanin and nicotine. Melanin is the substance that gives your color to our skin. Nicotine is stored in tissues that contain melanin. We learned this from the tobacco industry. They knew this. They've known this for 50 years. Punchline, the darker your skin means the more nicotine is stored in your body. So let's look back. It's stored more in your body. It slows down the metabolism of it. It creates more nicotine receptors. There's greater cell permeability. It's a setup. It's a setup. They've been killing us. It's okay. All right. Enough. Harder to quit. So after all of this goes on and you got all this stuff in your body, even though the slide is a decade old, and unfortunately we have like 15 other studies that show the same thing, it makes the point I'd like to make here, meaning that people who use menthol try to quit more often, nearly 10% more often. However, they are nearly 15% less successful in doing so. Menthol is hard to get off of. You know, the joke on the street, I mean, it's not a science, I know I'm a scientist, but the joke on the street is you're not only trying to get off cigarettes and nicotine, you're trying to get off menthol. And that makes it even much harder to quit, given all the things that I pointed out before that is going on with this substance. Predation. This is essentially what we've been talking about. The action of attacking or plundering where a predator, in this case the tobacco industry, feeds on its prey, the African American community and other marginalized groups. Here's a great slide. This slide is brought to us by LaTanisha Wright, who in 2004 quit working with the tobacco industry because of the Cool Mix campaign. She was part of the Cool Mix campaign and said, this is outrageous, and brought this to us, the tobacco control movement. And what we come to find out, the tobacco industry has labeled us as focused communities or non-focused communities. Focused communities are inner city, colored, and poor, while non-focused communities are upscale, suburban, rural, and white. This is the tobacco industry's language. They're already there. They're racist to the core. They may not admit to it, but this is their own documentation. And we know that menthol cigarettes are cheaper and more plentiful in the poor communities. Here's a great study by my colleague, Dr. Lisa Henriksen at Stanford University. It's an incredible, and the tobacco industry knows all this, and we're the ones just learning this. Punchline here is, as the percentage of African-American students increased, the proportion of menthol ads increased, or essentially what we call a dose-response relationship. The study they did is they looked at the actual advertising around schools in California. And as the enrollment of African Americans went up, the amount and the proportion of menthol ads increased. This is the definition of predatory marketing. Okay, it's an excellent study. It stands the test of time, unfortunately. That was California. This is Massachusetts, comparing Brookline, a predominantly white upscale community, with Dorchester, a predominantly poor colored community. And storefront advertising differed by community, to the point which there were significantly greater ads in Dorchester. The ads were significantly larger in Dorchester. The menthol ads were significantly more in Dorchester. And I guess what pisses me off the most is that pack of cigarettes in Dorchester was 50% cheaper. It's much cheaper to get your cigarettes in the Black community, to get your death sticks, as it were. Actually, we have data on this at a nationwide level, but I think showing the different coasts actually makes the point well. Here's my favorite slide. Menthol is a sacrificial lamb. That's a nice way to put it, because that's really other people that are being sacrificed. The lamb is just a representation of our sacrifice. A deal with the devil, question mark? I would suggest to you that the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act of 2009 was a deal with the devil. This was a deal cut between Phillip Morris, Southern senators, some members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and some members of the tobacco control movement. This was outrageous, frankly. This proposal, which Obama signed, and you see it on all these ads and et cetera, eliminated 13 flavors from cigarettes. You know, and I usually put them up there, and I'm not going to go through all of them now, but licorice and chocolate and strawberry and et cetera, all these flavors were eliminated. The only one that was left in was menthol. And essentially by leaving menthol in, they threw African Americans, women, youth, Native Hawaiians, Filipinos, folks from the LGBTQ community, Puerto Ricanos, folks with behavioral health issues, folks who are homeless, threw them all under the bus. In fact, if they'd have gotten rid of menthol in 2009 like they were supposed to, literally hundreds of thousands of lives of Black folks would have been saved. The fight to ban menthol takes off, even though we've been talking about it for years. In 2010 and 2011, many of us went back to Washington, D.C. to testify in front of the Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee, needing to get rid of this. Numerous scientific journals were published. My colleague, Dr. Valerie Yerger, had a number of ones published. I even published a couple of articles in terms of that. But the key point here for our purposes is that the TPSAC report, that is the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Committee report, quote, I quote it here, the removal of menthol products from the marketplace would be beneficial to the public's health. They straight up knew this then. That was a part of their report, and they haven't done a damn thing about it. Shows you how wild the world is. Yeah, of course, the report wasn't made available until 2013, but 18 months after the report came out, the Public Health Law Center in Minnesota circulated what is called, it's not the citizens petition, it's the citizen petition, saying that, wait a minute, it's been 18 months since you said this would be beneficial to the public health. You're dragging your feet. Look at how urgent we were back then. We all signed on. We said, oh, you agree with us, you should do something about it. That was 9 years ago, 10 years ago, 9 years ago. They still haven't done anything. We all signed on to it. This is what actually led to where we are today, or where we were a few years ago. In June of 2020, my organization, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, joined by Action on Smoking and Health, sued the Food and Drug Administration for dragging their feet on this subject and not dealing with the question of menthol. We were joined subsequently by the American Medical Association and the National Medical Association. The FDA finally said they would act, and last year in 2021, they ended up acting this year in April of 2022. The good is that they started the rulemaking process. They admitted that menthol should be, they already admitted this 9-10 years ago, admitted that menthol should be removed from the marketplace. They've included a rulemaking around flavored little cigars, which was a benefit. And then to actually promote this, and I should say this, it's important that they mention the importance of funding for cessation. And we're going to push them that if you're going to get rid of menthol cigarettes, you have to provide cessation services for the community that is going to be impacted the most on this. The bad is the good, the bad, and the ugly. The bad, of course, the rule was just made public in April a few months ago, and there was public discussion of it that was supposed to end in July, but of course the tobacco industry demanded they needed more time, and it didn't end until August of this year. Once now that the public comment is over, it's been pushed upstairs, as we like to say, to the Office on Management and Budget. The Office on Management and Budget has editorial control, meaning they can change the rule, they can modify the rule, they can do whatever the rule, and it may take a year as itself for it to come back from the Office on Management and Budget. Be clear, when it comes back down to the Food and Drug Administration, there will have to be a final comment period. We know the tobacco industry will demand that there be more time given for people to comment on it. Again, the punchline is, don't say that, Phil. The punchline will take years. The punchline will take years. And once a rule is actually put forward, the tobacco industry will sue. This is what they do. This is where they job. This is who they were. This is exactly what's going on here in California. The rule was, we passed a law in the House, in the Assembly, and in the legislature, the Senate, in 2020. The tobacco industry spent $20 million and actually collected 500,000 plus signatures and got it put on the ballot for this year, putting it off for 2 years. There's a possibility that if it passes here in the next 2 weeks, they may sue here. So the fight is just a little ways from over, folks. Let me dive into something that is not, people are not happy about, but let's be clear about what we're dealing with here. Don't believe the hype people are going to argue, particularly black mouthpieces that are paid by the industry, is that ending the sale of menthol would be racist toward black people, that it will lead to the criminalization of black people, and it will the rise of illicit market. I'm going to suggest that there's a no to each one of those questions. Let's look at that. Who are the racists here? The tobacco control advocates like myself, or the tobacco industry? Removing menthol cigarettes and flavored little cigars will be discriminatory toward black people. I would suggest that stands history on its head. As we've already pointed out, there's more advertising, there's more promotions, they're cheaper. The majority of African American civic, educational, political, cultural, and religious groups take money from the tobacco industry. This is how these flavored discs became our cigarettes. They were pushed down our throats, okay? We're not the racist, the tobacco industry is the racist. And targeting the cigarette that is killing us is actually doing something to help us, not hurt us. Who promotes criminalization, the tobacco control advocates or the tobacco industry? They are arguing that removing menthol cigarettes and flavored little cigars from the marketplace will lead to the criminalization of young black men. I need to say this as strongly as I can, and people to understand it as urgently as you can. Each law that has been passed around the country, I believe we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 or 89 jurisdictions that prohibit the sale of menthol cigarettes. They prohibit the sale. There's no law against possession. There's no law against purchase. There's no law against use, okay? Let's be clear. All these laws are aimed at retailers, okay? We've actually had the police chiefs of San Francisco and Oakland stand with us when this was passed. And for example, that this is under discussion in Detroit, Michigan as we speak. We've already got an agreement with the police chief there that they will have nothing to do with this. This is about prohibiting the sale by retailers, not the possession by individuals. The complaining of police violence, public health reforms will not save black lives. Using Eric Garner, the murder of Eric Garner by the police should be put in jail for that, but it has nothing to do with menthol cigarettes. And this enforcement should be on the store owners, not on the store clerks. Remember, most people who work at these the convenience stores or at the gas stations or these little places, these are young people, usually of color. We're not citing them. We need to cite the owners of these places. People argue that an illicit market will arise. Notice I haven't used the term black market. I want to encourage us to use the term illicit market and then push back because, you know, whether it's blackmail or whatever, black has become synonymous with bad in the United States. In any event, 72 cities and counties around the country have passed, I think it's up to 85 or 89 now, laws. No illicit market has arisen in any of these places. Canada's prohibited nationwide in 2018. No illicit market has arisen there. The European Union outlawed the sale of flavored tobacco products in 2020. No illicit market has arisen there. So let's be clear. This is the only place it can arise out is out of Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee, where tobacco is being produced by the tobacco industry. They're the ones in charge of this trash. Unintended consequences. I want to remind you folks, what about the intended consequences? As new research on this is where we began this presentation, I'm about through, okay? The intended consequences is that 1.5 million new African-American smokers were created between 1980 and 2018. 157,000 smoking-related premature deaths among African-American during that time period, and 1.5 million lives years lost among African-Americans. This is the intended consequences. People always talk about the intended is essentially the murder of African Americans. I would suggest to you the fight must continue and that we can't wait on the FDA. Lives are at stake. We must continue the fight for local and state bans. I've recently have been working and traveling in Charleston, South Carolina, and Columbus, Ohio. Columbus, Ohio is set to take this up in the middle of November. Also, Westchester County in New York is set to take this up in the middle of November. It has been 12 years since the passage of the Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act in 2009. I would suggest to you that was the original sin. Hundreds of thousands of Black lives didn't have to die. Enough is enough. The take-home message, menthol is a social justice issue. The disproportionate marketing and targeting of candy-flavored poison to African Americans and other specially oppressed sectors of our society is outright discriminatory and genocidal. We're talking about folks who are the poorest, the least informed, folks with the fewest resources. Indeed, the definition of preying on the most vulnerable sectors of our society. If menthol were banned, hundreds of thousands of lives would be saved. Just if 30% of the people quit who use menthol, just 30%, not 50, not 70%, just 30%, over 500,000 lives would be saved. 250,000 then would be Black folks. So what's at stake? I'm going to suggest to you that our future is at stake, that our children are at stake. Here's young blood on a skateboard, baggy pants, hat backward, surrounded by tobacco industry, imagery, the same thing, industry and imagery. That's what's at stake. It's our future that's at stake. With that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to thank you for your time this morning. Again, I'm Dr. Phillip Gardiner. I'm one of the co-chairs of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. Go to our website, savingblacklives.org. It's interesting, we have that tagline long before it became popular. We've been trying to save Black lives when it wasn't popular. Having said that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll take any questions that folks have.
First off, Doctor, I'd like to say hello and thank you for your presentation today. I'm part of that community that has been targeted, not only been targeted, but has been taken advantage of in the light of those things that, the way, in other words, to how they've been pursuing us. And I guess the question that I have for you is that how can one begin the process of removal in their own state? Say, for instance, like myself here in the state of Missouri, right around the corner from Tennessee, where they're making the tobacco. Right? How do I begin the process of going to the assembly individuals and legislators to suggest to them that menthol should be removed from counties and cities around Missouri? So what is the process and how can I,
That's a great question. There are actually, and I actually know people that are doing it. What we did here in California and what we've done in other states is you want to start with some cities. You want to start with something that's doable. The further up the food chain you go, from city to county to state to federal, the more influence the tobacco industry has. So identifying a city near St. Louis that has got a progressive city council person or a preacher that can speak out in terms that, get a couple of Black doctors like myself to come out and speak on this and get a local resolution passed. It led to, in California, it led to somewhat of a snowball effect. Then we got it passed in a number of other different areas. Then we got it passed in some of the larger cities. Then when San Francisco did it in 2018, then a snowball effect took place. And everything around the Bay Area. Then we went to the state and then we got it passed. Also, you can work both sides of the street at the same time, as we like to say, meaning that you can talk to your state representatives while at the same time talking to your city representatives. I don't know what city you're in specifically, but keep that in mind. That is one way to move this process forward. But that's a great, and Frank, that's not only a great question, that's the question. How do we move this process forward? And you're right. When you're right next door to the tobacco industry,
Right.
you gotta do something about it.
Yes,
I
yes.
agree.
Thank you very much. Very powerful presentation. I really appreciate it. Again, I'm in that percentile of hard to kick the menthol. It was amazing. I was like, man, this was brought to me for a reason. In other words, not only to encourage me, but to push me, in other words, to, what you call it, that death stick, that favorite death stick, to dispose of it, in other words, and to advocate for the removal of it in my community. So thanks.
Good morning, Phil. Thank you again. You've been doing this work a long time, and I've been observing you and working with you in a lot of different spaces. But what I really do always appreciate about this conversation and sort of the framing of it is looking at corporations as the problem, and you can almost kind of replace tobacco or any other entity that happens that kind of drives corporate wealth in this country as really being the problem, and really being able to figure out how do you address these huge public health issues, and kind of going back into looking at policy and how those impact the corporate entities that are responsible as opposed to individuals. And so I always really appreciate that perspective. And it's always easy for people to kind of spin the facts and spin the truth by talking about freedom, individual rights, and all of these things. And again, you can replace tobacco with lots of other things as we see, how politics work in this country. So thank you.
Yeah, no, people always it's always the individual's fault. It's either their choice or their fault. And the punchline is the individuals have very little to do with this. Most people start smoking when they're under the age of 21. Their brain isn't fully functioning, as we all thought at 17, that we're gonna live forever. And if we don't, who cares? I'm bad. And as we grow older, I was gonna ask Obi, did you smoke menthol?
Yes, I did. So I was right. My mother smoked the cool cigarettes. I grew up in the 80s in Los Angeles, California. I had a plethora of ads all around me all of the time. I eventually, again, start at an early age, 12 years old, 13 years old, puffing on my mama cool cigarettes, because again, it was being cool.
That's
to
right.
do that. And then I, went over from, smoking that to then Newports. Again, even sort of kind of getting caught up in, again, that what you referenced to as the new wave, right? So the new generation. So started off on mom, I caught in the cool motion, but then I went from cool to wanting to be pleasured, messing with the Newports. And so, I just realized and understand, listening to this presentation and seeing that information about the mannerisms of how they did that. And not, not always taking self-responsibility, but also looking at, the influence around the choices that I made to take responsibility for those things.
No, I hear you. I appreciate your testimony. When I quit playing basketball in college, an unfortunate accident I had, I began to smoke cigarettes, but I was hanging around with the Black Student Union and doing a lot of political work, and everybody who was smoking then was smoking Cools. So I said, oh, I'm gonna smoke Cools. Yeah. And I smoked Cools up until the mid-1980s when I finally got some sense and quit. But your testimony, and I didn't even go into this, and at some point we can do this in more depth. Why Newport won out over all these? Newport's the #1 selling menthol cigarette in the world, in the United States, and among Black people. And that during the 1980s, when you took it up, they began to, there's a relationship between nicotine and menthol that we're only beginning to know about. And the tobacco industry knows that if you lower the nicotine and raise the menthol, you're going to get the same throat hit. Or if you raise the nicotine and lower the menthol. So they knew how to manipulate it. And menthol folks at what was Brown and Williams then, and now Reynolds American, and now British American, manipulated it such that Newport became the new cool. It wasn't too harsh, but it wasn't too soft, and it's where we are today. So I appreciate your testimony. Unfortunately, proof of that.
Yes, thank you for your info.
Well, thank you all.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Gardiner, for this presentation. I've heard it over and over again, but it's just as powerful every time. So I really appreciate you taking the time out this morning. Thank you to everyone else for taking the time out on a Saturday morning. We really appreciate you joining us. I have one last ask. If you all could fill out our evaluation survey. I just put the link in the chat. That would be really appreciated. It should only take you about 2 minutes. There are a couple of questions that you can bubble in, and then a couple of sections where you can give a long answer about how much you enjoyed this presentation. So thank you again. I'll give you all back your Saturday, and have a great weekend.
Look, folks, thank you for having me. Camille, I'll be in touch.
Bye, everyone. That was great.
Oh, you're still there?
Oh, I'm fired up and ready to go.
Hi.
Can you stop recording? I have to say something.